The East African coast. Can you really talk about the history of Kenya without talking about the East African coast? Impossible. You can't talk about Kenya's history without talking about the East African coast, because the coast was the entry point through which Kenya became connected to the wider world. Now, have you ever stopped and asked yourself, who were the first foreigners to ever come to Kenya? Not tourists, not missionaries, not colonialists. We are talking about much earlier visitors. Because the coast lies along the Indian Ocean, it was naturally open to the outside world. This made interaction between coastal communities and foreign visitors frequent and very widespread. Centuries ago, long before modern maps existed, ships from faraway lands were already sailing across the Indian Ocean and arriving on the East African coast. But how did they find this place? Why were they coming here? And what did they discover when they arrived? A major factor that encouraged travel to the East African coast was the monsoon wind system. Between November and April, the winds blew ships towards the East African coast. Then, between May and October, the winds changed direction and carried ships away from the coast. This predictable pattern of the monsoon winds is what made sea travel reliable even in ancient times. Traders and sailors knew exactly when to come and when to leave. As a result, the coast became a regular stopping point rather than just a risky destination. Because of this accessibility, the East African coast began receiving visitors very early in history. The earliest known visitors were Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Indonesians. These early contacts laid the foundation for long-distance trade and cultural exchange along the coast. Over time, even more groups arrived from different parts of the world. So let's look at who these early visitors to the coast included. The Greeks were some of the earliest visitors to arrive at the East African coast. The Greeks came to East Africa because of trade quarrels and rivalries between two groups. The first group was the Seleucid rulers in Greece, and the second, the Ptolemaic Greeks in Egypt. They were fighting over control of the land trade route to the east through the Mediterranean. As demand for ivory grew, the Ptolemies made their own mission to look for new routes, and that's how they ended up sailing through the Red Sea and eventually managing to reach the East African coast. And we know that the Greeks were some of the earliest visitors to the coast because a Ptolemaic gold coin was actually found near Dar es Salaam. Romans were also some of the earliest visitors to get to the East African coast. The Romans did not reach the East African coast by chance. Their arrival was made possible by a powerful natural system that we've already talked about, the monsoon winds. For centuries, sailors had noticed that the winds over the Indian Ocean changed direction at certain times of the year. But it was the Romans who learned how to navigate the Indian Ocean effectively for the very first time. The ability of the Romans to sail on the Indian Ocean was made possible by a discovery that was made by a Roman sailor known as Hippolytus. When Hippolytus made this discovery, he realized that by following the monsoon winds, ships could sail directly across the Indian Ocean, and this discovery dramatically reduced travel time and made long-distance sea trade much easier and more reliable. With sea trade made much easier by Hippolytus' discovery, Roman traders were able to eventually reach the East African coast. Once they figured out how to do that, they started arriving at the coast regularly and in greater numbers. So why did the Romans come to the East African coast? The Romans had a clear goal: They wanted to break the Arab monopoly on trade in the Indian Ocean. At the time, Arab traders controlled much of the trade between Africa, India, and the Middle East. So the Romans were hoping to arrive and interrupt that control. By sailing directly using the monsoon winds, the Romans hoped to trade without relying on Arab middlemen, allowing them greater access to valuable goods and allowing them to make a lot more profits. Evidence of Roman contact with the East African coast actually comes from written records. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote about the busy trade networks linking India, Arabia, and China, and his writings show that the Indian Ocean was an active and well-connected trading world, one in which the East African coast played a very, very important role. These records confirm that the coast was already part of international trade during Roman times. It is important to mention that even though the Romans were some of the first foreigners to arrive at the East African coast, Roman influence on the East African coast did not last forever. In the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire collapsed, and this collapse disrupted international trade routes and weakened long-distance commercial networks that the Romans had been establishing for centuries. As a result, Roman trade declined, contact with the East African coast reduced, Roman influence along the coast slowly faded, and other trading powers later took their place. After the Romans, another powerful group entered the story of the East African coast, and these were the Persians. The earliest Persians to arrive at the East African coast mainly came from Shiraz, which is located on the eastern shore of the Persian Gulf. Because of this origin, these Persians that arrived at the East African coast first are often referred to as Shirazi Persians. The Persians arrived during the time of the Sassanid dynasty, and this dynasty ruled Persia between 224 and 636 AD, and this dynasty had one major goal: to rebuild the Persian Empire, and they intended to do this through wealth from trade. By the 6th century AD, Persian traders were already deeply involved in international trade. They traded with India, China. They also controlled important regions such as parts of the Red Sea, Egypt, Arabia, and joining trade along the East African coast was therefore a natural expansion of their commercial ambitions. Unlike the Greeks and the Romans who only visited seasonally, what's so different about the Persian traders that arrived in the East African coast is that many of them settled permanently along the coast. They joined existing East African trade networks, made permanent settlements, and over time, they intermarried with local African communities, therefore creating strong social and cultural ties. The more these Shirazi Persians intermarried, the more they were able to insert themselves in society, to the extent that Persians very quickly dominated the Africans that had settled in the East African coast, and they became rulers, establishing local ruling families, including the Shirazi dynasty. What most people do not know is that one of the most lasting contributions of these Shirazi Persians that arrived first at the East African coast was the introduction of Islam to the coast. Through settlement and intermarriage, Islam slowly spread along coastal communities, becoming a key part of Swahili culture, which is a legacy that remains visible in Kenya up to today. When they arrived, the Persians also brought new goods and technologies to the coast. This included the introduced glass bowls, glass beakers, swords, pots, glass beads and ornaments, as well as tin and metal tools. Archaeological discoveries of such items have been found along the coast to provide evidence of active Persian trade and settlement in the East African region. Persian dominance along the East African coast did not last forever. Over time, they were overthrown by the Arabs, who went on to dominate trade and politics along the coast for centuries. The next group of early visitors to arrive at the East African coast were the Chinese. So during the Middle Ages, the East African coast also started attracting visitors from as far away as China. Chinese coins dating to around 700 AD have been discovered in coastal areas. Even more convincing are the porcelain remains, bowls, and plates found at various coastal sites. These discoveries clearly confirm that Chinese traders reached the East African coast and traded there. Like most of the early visitors that made contact, Chinese fleets sailed across the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds. It is believed that the last Chinese fleet reached Mogadishu around 1430 AD, and after this period, Chinese voyages to the East African coast came to an end. Trade between the Chinese and the East African coast was based on exchange. The Chinese brought silk cloth, porcelain bowls, and plates. In return, they took valuable African products such as gold, leopard skins, rhino horns, tortoise shells, and ivory. Then finally, another group of early visitors were the Arabs. By around 1000 AD, the Arabs had begun crossing the Indian Ocean to the East African coast. This movement did not stop quickly. It continued steadily until about 1500 AD. Over these 5 centuries, Arab contact with the coast grew stronger and it became more permanent, leaving a deep impact on Kenya's coastal history. So why did the Arabs come to the East African coast? One of the biggest reasons was trade. By this time, the Indian Ocean trade was booming and extremely profitable. Arab traders were attracted by valuable commodities found along the coast and the interior, such as ivory, slaves, animal skins, gold, beeswax, and more. The East African coast offered these goods cheaply and in high demand across Asia and the Middle East. Religion was another powerful motivation. Many Arabs were strong Muslims who wanted to spread Islam along the coast. Their aim was to Islamize the coastal communities and eventually establish a Muslim empire along the East African coast. Through trade, settlement, and intermarriage, Islam spread widely and became deeply rooted in the coastal society. The East African coast also had natural advantages that attracted Arab settlers. It was blessed with good natural harbors, which allowed even large ships to anchor safely. It had fresh drinking water, which is essential for settlement. It had fertile soils with plenty of free land suitable for agriculture. These conditions made long-term settlement possible, not just short visits. Just like earlier visitors, the Arabs were assisted by the monsoon winds. These winds blew Arab dhows towards the East African coast at specific times of the year, making sea travel predictable and safe. In some cases, Arabs even landed on the coast unintentionally after being driven there by the winds, and later, these groups of people, after mingling with the community and trading and realizing the benefits of staying at the coast, later decided to make permanent settlements. We should note that not all Arabs came willingly or for trade. Political persecution and power struggles in Arabia actually forced a lot of Arabs to flee to the East African coast. Another reason for the coming of the Arabs to the East African coast was that many young Arab men were driven by the spirit of adventure and the desire to explore unknown lands. So naturally, they were guided towards the East African coast, having seen the success of others that had come before them. And finally, the hospitality of the coastal people played a big role in the huge numbers of Arabs that arrived. Local communities welcomed Arab visitors, making it easier for them to settle, trade, and eventually integrate themselves into the local society. The Arabs therefore came to the East African coast for many reasons: trade, religion, safety, land, water, and opportunities. And their long presence transformed the coast by strengthening the Indian Ocean trade, spreading Islam, influencing culture, language, as well as settlement patterns. By the time European powers arrived, the East African coast was already deeply Arabized and Islamized thanks to centuries of Arab interaction. So when we look back at this history, it raises an interesting question. If the Greeks, Romans, Persians, and Arabs had never sailed to the East African coast, would Kenya's history have unfolded in the same way? Would the Swahili coast have developed the same cultures and trading cities? Would outsiders have eventually discovered this region the way they did? And later on, would Kenya still have been colonized? We may never know the exact answers, but what we do know is that those early visitors opened the door to centuries of contact between East Africa and the rest of the world. So as we've seen in this video, the East African coast was not isolated. For centuries, visitors from Greece, Rome, Persia, and Arabia were already sailing across the ocean and arriving here. These early contacts connected this region to the wider world and began shaping the history of the Swahili coast and in general, the history of Kenya. But these visits were only the beginning, because very soon, the East African coast would become part of something much bigger, one of the greatest trading networks in the ancient world. In our next video, we will explore the Indian Ocean trade and how merchants, sailors, and traders turned the East African coast into an important center of global trade. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or if you'd like to add something to this story, please leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, and we can't wait to see you in the next video.